Well, it's a very good point. I've just written several articles on the issue of sexual assault and rape of women and men in the military. And the statistics are that 1 in 3 women, as a minimum, who join the U.S. military will be raped while they're in the military. 1 in 3. And this is an organization that supposedly, controls its own people. That you protect your own. Well, that's not true in the military. And just 2 months ago, at a hearing, congressional hearing on sexual assault in the military, the Deputy Chief of Personnel for the Army gave the statistic, first time in public, that we've heard the Army say that 10% of the people who reported being raped in the Army last year, 10% of those people were men. Well, you could have heard a pin drop in that congressional room when the general said that. And it parallels pretty much the statistics we've been getting informally from counselors who say that there are a lot of guys that come to them to say that that's what happened to them. The other thing that, the statistics like that are something that ought to be on the front of every recruiting office, so that every young woman, every young man that walks through there knows the dangers that lurk, not only from an enemy, a foreign enemy, but a domestic enemy, your own buddies in the military. And if a great civic project would be if you just get some tape and go tape it on the recruiting station and then just mark on it, 1 in 3 women sexually assaulted, raped. And of course the police will get called, and there will be a big to-do and the media will be there, and finally we'll get some real media on this, that young women ought to know that this is a predatory organization they're going into. Another very interesting statistic is on the issue of sexual assault and deaths in the military. In Iraq, we've had 102 women that have been killed in Iraq. Out of those, 42 of them were killed in non-combat related incidents. And of the 42, 20 of them are under very, very suspicious circumstances. 13 of those 20, the military has said they committed suicide. Now, the suicides range anywhere from a young woman who was raped, and 10 days later she was found dead in her barracks. The military at first told the parents, she was depressed from being raped. Well, she was definitely angry from being raped. Her mother knew that, but she had not gotten any sense that she was suicidally depressed from it. When they finally got all the records back on her death and started comparing, they had a forensic specialist check, if the weapon were fired at what angle to produce the wounds that it did, and then how would she have had to held that M16 rifle, and she was 5 feet 1 inches tall, and it turned out she couldn't have held the rifle that way because her arm wasn't long enough to do that. Now the Army says, well, she pulled the trigger with her big toe. Oh, another one, a young woman named Lavina Johnson was bruised, battered, her face bashed in, bite marks on her. Her genital areas, it looked like somebody had poured corrosive acid in it. She'd been burned on her back. In fact, when her body was brought home, her mother felt her arm, and the glove that was on her hand wouldn't move. And it wouldn't move, and they had the mortician cut it off, and it had been glued onto her hand because they were trying to cover wounds, burns on her arm and on her back. The Army says she committed suicide and then set herself on fire, and the tent that she was found in on fire. The list of the descriptions of how these women died are very, very suspicious. So we're urging the Army to reopen these cases because of the 13 of them, 12 of them are Army. There are some very dangerous bases that we have. Fort Hood, Texas is a very dangerous base for women. In Iraq, Camp Taji is a very dangerous place for women. I've written several stories on this. There are several articles that you can find in Common Dream, well, after Downing Street, Common Dreams, Truth Out, and Truth Dig. And These are things that we need to make sure that young women and men know about before they join the military. Thank you.
I had a question about absentee ballots. I know in the 2004 election, it wasn't close enough sort of balance between the two candidates, they weren't counted. Now, is that still true?
It's not supposed to be. They're supposed to be counted.
Regardless, right? But
Yes.
I'm fairly certain in 2004, maybe 2000, I don't remember, they weren't counted if there were people occupied.
It's hard to say such a thing about the country. You have to tell me which states you're talking, because we have this hodgepodge of electoral systems in states and hundreds of counties, you know, and we ought to have a national standard of elections, and it ought to come somewhat close to international standards, so that people like Jimmy Carter, who monitor elections around the world, don't say, well, I won't even try to monitor a U.S. election because it doesn't even pretend to come up to reasonable standards. We ought to. We ought to have the right to vote in the Constitution, which we don't, and we ought to have the right to directly elect the president rather than this stupid electoral college. There are lots of things that ought to be changed, but lots of shenanigans go on with absentee ballots and every other kind of ballot in different states and districts, including Florida 2000.
Other questions? I would just like to ask a question of you, Anne, sort of in deference to the fact that this program is co-sponsored by the Department of Religion and Philosophy. I'm kind of a black-white thinker myself, so it's always been way too easy for me to be judgmental and to say this is wrong and this is right, and I know, and you know, but in point of fact, life isn't like that. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the factors that were important to you, not perhaps just the criminality of the invasion of Iraq, but there were certainly moral and ethical issues involved in that invasion as well. Could you talk to us about some of the things you thought about?
Well, you know, many people have brought up to me that why did it take you so long to resign? I mean, there were so many other policies during the nearly 40 years that I was in the U.S. government that other people had resigned over. There were endless protests over many of the policies of the various administrations, certainly the Vietnam War being one of them, and yet that was the time that I joined the military. For me, you know, as a part of working for the U.S. government, there will always be policies that you as an individual don't agree with within every administration. But whether or not it rises to the point that you feel like you must get out of the government, that you just can't represent the government in any way because of those policies. I guess I always found areas where I could work during times of very unpopular policies in ways that weren't really working with that policy at all. Because, you know, the federal government has endless programs and policies. For me, the invasion of Iraq was, you know, just over the top. I mean, having been in the military and the State Department and our policies in the Middle East of continually supporting Israel, an unbalanced policy, in my opinion, between the Israeli and Palestinian issues, and then which just in the Middle East is just, I mean, people just shake their heads. How could this 60 years later, how could the United States still have unbalanced policies where we really just don't give credence at all to the Palestinian side of what's going on? And so for us to go directly into that region where American policies are hated to the extent that even on 9/11, I mean, young men hijacked airplanes and blew up these buildings because of unbalanced policies of the U.S. And then the United States was going to invade and occupy a Muslim country. Much different from what happened when Saddam invaded Kuwait and the international community went in to kick him out But now we were doing that invasion, and it just was so, I just could not believe that we were doing it, and anybody that had dealt with international relations knew exactly what was going to happen. That young men and women of the Arab and Muslim worlds were going to be furious. They would sacrifice their lives to go after anyone that invaded. And, you know, it was the U.S. that did it, but if the Russians had done it, why? They would have gone after the Russians. If, you know, when the Russians invaded Afghanistan, there was a resistance. Of course, the United States helped that resistance tremendously by giving Stinger missiles and everything else to it. But just as, gosh, a resistance in Iraq is another, are countries giving those resistors aid and help? Well, yeah, Bush says, yeah, they're coming in from Iran, they're coming in from here, they're coming in from there. Well, we knew what was going to happen. It was going to be a disaster. When I resigned, over 400 people in the diplomatic corps emailed me within a couple of days saying, you've done the right thing to resign. This is going to be just the biggest mess in the whole world, and I wish I could resign, but I've got kids in college, I've got mortgages, I've got this and that. I can't resign. I just can't do it. But I'm going to work within the system to try to soften the effects of these policies. Well, you can sure see they were not very successful. And I would say that every one of them probably has a massive case of ulcers for having stayed in the government and endured what they knew was going to be a horrific, horrific time for our country, for the government.
Okay, I think that's it.
Got one more question here. Short question, short answer.
Okay, those are hard ones.
I agree with also something that I don't remember if David said or you, Ann, said, but about having to go past the election, because no matter what happens in the election, see past that for criminal prosecutions. But isn't it true that impeachment could happen still first in a very short amount of time? And that happens while someone's in. But I also read, is this accurate? You can impeach someone even after they're out of office and then follow that up with criminal prosecution. Is that correct?
Yes, it is, and it has been done. There was a Secretary of War, as we used to more honestly call it, who was impeached despite having already resigned his office. Now, he was acquitted in the Senate, and some of the senators who acquitted argued that it was inappropriate to convict him because he was out of office. So you have somewhat of a mixed precedent there, but in terms of the Constitution, we certainly can and must impeach Bush and Cheney at the least as soon as possible after the election if necessary, after the new Congress comes in if necessary, after Bush and Cheney are out of office themselves if necessary, and after they are dead if necessary, because it has nothing to do with punishing them. It has to do with setting a standard for future presidents and vice presidents that they have to actually obey laws. And so it's much, much more important than who's going to be president for 6 weeks or who's going to be put in jail or punished. And you know, there are penalties after they're out of office. They can be denied pensions. They can be denied the right to ever again hold any federal office if they wanted to run for senator or dog catcher or anything. But that's the trivial results. The important thing is to establish the rule of law, and it ought to be done. But it grows increasingly less likely, whereas prosecution has much more opportunity.
Who didn't get a copy of Ann's book coming in, so be sure to get one going out. Or 10, get them for all your friends, the holiday.